30 days ago, I made a decision that to many people may have sounded unusual or even a little bit extreme. I decided to completely replace Windows with Linux on my primary computer and use it for everything I normally do, unreversed, uninterrupted real usage. No dual boot, no backup plan, no secretly planning to go back after a weekend. Just me, Linux, and whatever hurdles came in the way. At the time, I thought I knew what to expect. I assumed I'd put up with a few quirks, learn some commands, install a few applications, maybe suffer through some compatibility problems, and then after a month I'd be back on Windows, grateful for familiarity. I was wrong. What happened instead completely changed my perspective on how I use computers, how I think about software freedom, and even how I define productivity itself. This is my story, what I discovered, what surprised me, and the lessons I learned. The first morning with Linux started with an odd mix of excitement and anxiety. I've used Windows my whole life since forever, and the idea of breaking that pattern was electrifying. But there was also a nagging, what if this goes horribly wrong? Feeling in the back of my mind. I booted up for the first time and was met with a login screen that was unfamiliar yet strangely clean and minimal. The desktop environment I chose was polished and intuitive, but there was no start menu in the traditional sense. I remember sitting there thinking, okay, this is different, but not in a bad way, just new. My first task was simple. Install all the applications I normally use. That turned out to be less straightforward than I expected. Some of the apps I relied on didn't have native Linux versions. Photoshop? No. Some niche Windows-only productivity apps? Also no, I anticipated this, so I had prepared a list of alternatives. GIMP replaced Photoshop, and I downloaded LibreOffice in place of Microsoft Office. I installed everything I thought I needed, not really sure if these replacements would be adequate. And then I dove in. The first real test was productivity. Could I write, edit spreadsheets, manage email, and work on creative projects the same way I did on Windows? My initial expectation was that it would be slightly slower and a bit clunky, but I was completely blown away. The performance of the applications I installed was snappy. GIMP wasn't a perfect Photoshop clone, but for most tasks it was more than enough. LibreOffice handled spreadsheets and documents without freezing or crashing. My workflow wasn't disrupted once I learned where everything was. I quickly realized that sheer familiarity had been holding me back more than any real capability limitation. But it wasn't just about applications. What impressed me first was stability. Whereas on Windows I would often get random updates that rebooted my computer unexpectedly, or system slowdowns after long uptime, Linux just ran. Days passed without a reboot, even weeks. And when updates did occur, they were clearly communicated, modular, and optional. There was no forced reboot in the middle of a task. For someone who values uninterrupted focus, this was huge. Over the first week, I began to notice subtle improvements in my computing experience. Things just felt lighter. Applications opened instantly. My machine ran cool, quiet, and efficiently. There were no intrusive alerts, no nagging upgrade prompts, and no hidden processes chewing up CPU in the background. I started my computer intending to work, not just to cope with it. This was my first indication that Linux was doing something Windows never had. It was getting out of my way. Of course, it wasn't all smooth sailing. In the first few days, I definitely ran into a few challenges. One of the big ones was hardware compatibility. My mouse, keyboard, printer, and external hard drive all worked fine, but my Wi-Fi adapter didn't perform optimally right away. I had to install a proprietary driver and tweak a setting in the terminal. This was a bit nerve-wracking because, let's be honest, if you'd asked the old me a year ago if I'd be typing random commands into a terminal to make my Wi-Fi better, I would have laughed. But once I actually did it, I was pleasantly surprised at how easy and straightforward it was. The Linux community had already documented the steps clearly, and within minutes I was back online with full speed. Speaking of the terminal, that brings me to another surprise. I actually liked using it. I thought the terminal was something reserved for hardcore hackers or people who enjoy memorizing arcane commands. Boy, was I mistaken. Once I started using the terminal to install software, update the system, and manage files, I realized how powerful and efficient it could be. Typing a few simple commands was faster than navigating menus, and I felt in control in a way I never felt on Windows. It was empowering. I wasn't afraid of it. I welcomed it. Another early challenge was gaming. I knew going in that Linux had limitations when it came to a gaming, but I wasn't prepared for how different the experience could be. Some games ran flawlessly through compatibility layers like Proton. Others ran but with glitches, and a few simply refused to launch. I was a bit disappointed at first. There went my weekend gaming, but as someone who writes for a living and creates content, I realized something important. I wasn't playing games all that much anymore. They were a distraction more than a hobby. Instead of mourning what I couldn't play, I started rediscovering hobbies I had neglected: reading, drawing, going for walks. This was an unexpected side effect of switching to Linux. It made me re-examine how I spend my time. In week 2, I encountered an issue with one of my essential work programs. It didn't have a Linux equivalent, and the compatibility solution I tried just didn't cut it. I had to rethink my approach. Rather than giving up, I found alternative software that did the same job, and in some ways did it better. It wasn't a perfect one-to-one match, but it was good enough, and the switch ended up expanding my skill set. I learned new software, learned new workflows, and by the end of the second week, I realized that I was no longer trying to force Linux to be Windows. Instead, I was embracing Linux on its own terms. As the days went on, I became more comfortable. I learned how to customize my desktop environment, set up window behaviors, tweak themes, and even automate routine tasks using scripts. Tasks that were clunky on Windows suddenly felt refined and elegant. I could control exactly how my system behaved. If something annoyed me, I changed it. If something worked beautifully, I fine-tuned it even further. In contrast to Windows, where most of the user interface is fixed and controlled by Microsoft, Linux gave me freedom. Around day 14, I hit a psychological turning point. I remember it clearly because I realized I hadn't thought about Windows at all for an entire day. Not once. In the past, if I ever used someone else's Windows PC, I would immediately notice everything that was different. The icons, the way Windows opened, the menus, the quirks. But with Linux, after 2 weeks, I didn't miss anything. Not a single menu, not a single feature. This was when I began to think that maybe this experiment would last longer than 30 days. Maybe it wasn't temporary. Halfway through, I started paying attention to how productive I was. I used tracking tools and self-reporting to evaluate my focus, number of tasks completed, time spent writing, and overall satisfaction with my day. The results were fascinating. My productivity went up significantly. On average, I completed almost 30% more tasks per day and reported far fewer distractions. I can't prove this was because of Linux, but the correlation was undeniable. I felt calmer, more in control, and less interrupted. There were no pop-ups, no ads, no software nagging me to upgrade or buy something. Everything just worked, or it gave me a clear message about how to make it work. This clarity was like a breath of fresh air. By this point, I had become pretty comfortable with the Linux ecosystem. I had a favorite terminal theme, a set of go-to applications, and a workflow that felt natural. I found myself recommending Linux to friends and family, not because I wanted them to use my system, but because I genuinely believed that for many people it could offer a better experience than Windows, especially for those who value customization, stability, and performance. One thing that continued to surprise me was how lightweight Linux was compared to Windows. My computer's boot time was half as long, memory usage was significantly lower, and even older machines performed better. I installed Linux on an old laptop I had lying around, and what was once a sluggish, barely functional device became a reliable little machine for browsing, writing, and video chatting. This wasn't just nostalgia talking, it was real, measurable performance improvement. During week 3, I started to reflect on my preconceived notions about operating systems. I had spent years in a Windows-centric mindset, assuming that familiarity equated to superiority. I clung to the idea that because most people use Windows, it must be the best option. But Linux had shown me something different. Popularity doesn't necessarily equal quality, and choice matters. With Linux, I felt like the computer was my tool, not something that dictated how I should use it. There was still the occasional irritation. Certain hardware drivers weren't perfect on Linux, and there were moments when I had to troubleshoot unexpected behavior. But every time I solved a problem, whether by diving into forums, reading documentation, or running a command, I learned something new. These moments weren't setbacks. They were opportunities. Windows had trained me to expect problems, but Linux trained me to solve them. That shift in mindset was transformational. By day 21, I had crossed into unfamiliar territory. I was actually considering using Linux permanently. The very idea that seemed crazy a month ago was now something I genuinely considered. I asked myself, if I could use an operating system that gave me more freedom, more control, better performance, and fewer distractions, why wouldn't I? It wasn't about being anti-Windows. It was about choosing what worked best for me, and Linux did. But then I had a reality check. Not everything is perfect. There were still compatibility gaps. Some software ecosystems just aren't as mature on Linux. If you rely on specific Windows-only professional tools, the transition might be harder. I had to be honest with myself. Linux is wonderful, but it isn't a one-size-fits-all magic solution. For some people, it might be ideal. For others, especially in specialized professional environments, the transition would require careful planning and adjustment. Still, by week 4 I felt so comfortable that I barely noticed the operating system I was using anymore. It became invisible, in the best way possible. Computers are tools, and the best tools are the ones you forget about because they allow you to do your work without friction. Linux had become that tool for me. On day 30, I sat down and reflected on the entire experiment. What had started as a curiosity turned into a profound shift in how I think about technology. I gained not just a new operating system, but a new mindset, a willingness to explore alternatives, a confidence in my ability to solve problems, and a clearer sense of what I actually need from my computer. I realized that so much of what we accept as normal in technology, forced updates, intrusive notifications, lockdown interfaces, is not inevitable. It's a choice. And it doesn't have to be the only choice. When I uninstalled Linux at the end of the experiment, it wasn't because it failed. It wasn't because I missed Windows or couldn't adapt. I removed it because the experiment ended. But something had changed forever. I no longer see Windows as the default, unquestionable standard. I no longer fear trying new systems. I know what an alternative can feel like, and that knowledge has reshaped how I approach technology in my life. So would I recommend that you replace Windows with Linux for 30 days? Yes, but with one caveat. Be ready to learn. Be ready to adapt, and be open to surprise yourself. This experiment shocked me more than I expected, not because Linux was flawless, but because it challenged assumptions I never knew I held. It taught me that comfort is not the same as capability, that familiarity is not the same as best, and that freedom, real freedom to control your tools, is worth exploring. Thank you for listening to my journey from Windows to Linux. If you're curious about trying it yourself, take the leap. You might be surprised at what you discover.